Thomas after the resurrection. The hidden words he heard from Jesus. There is a moment in the Gospel of John that has fascinated readers for 2,000 years. It is not the feeding of the 5,000. It is not the raising of Lazarus. It is not the Sermon on the Mount or the washing of feet or any of the grand dramatic scenes that dominate the popular imagination of what the Gospels contain. It is a smaller moment. A more intimate moment. A moment that takes place in a locked room, on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples had gathered behind closed doors out of fear. Jesus appears. He shows them his hands and his side. He breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And then the Gospel notes, almost as an aside, that one of the 12 was not present. Thomas, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. That absence. That single, specific, noted absence. That is where one of the most consequential stories in the history of Christianity begins. And it is where one of the most misunderstood figures in the entire Gospel tradition enters the story in a way that has defined how subsequent generations have read and misread him. Because Thomas did not believe what the others told him. He said, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." 8 days later, Jesus appeared again. Thomas was present this time. And Jesus invited him to do exactly what he had said he needed to do. To put his finger in the wounds. To reach out his hand. The text of John's Gospel does not tell us whether Thomas actually touched the wounds or simply saw them and believed without touching. It is one of the ambiguities that the text leaves open and that interpreters have argued about for centuries. But what the text does record is Thomas's response to the presence of the risen Jesus. "My Lord and my God." It is the most complete declaration of faith in the entire Gospel of John. Compressed into 6 words. Spoken by the man who had refused to believe without evidence. And then, almost immediately, Thomas disappears from the canonical narrative. He is mentioned once more in the Gospel of John, in the list of disciples who go fishing and encounter the risen Jesus at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. After that, his name appears only in the lists of the apostles in the Acts of the Apostles. The man who made the most complete declaration of faith in the 4th Gospel speaks no more in the canonical record. He has no letters. He has no extended teachings. He has no prominent role in the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter and Paul and Stephen and Philip and James all have significant narrative presence. He is mentioned in lists and then he is gone. And yet, there is a text that bears his name. A text that was discovered in the 20th century in the Egyptian desert, buried in a sealed jar, preserved by the dry climate of Upper Egypt for nearly 2,000 years. A text that claims to be not simply a story about Thomas, but a collection of the words of Jesus recorded by Thomas. A text that begins with a claim so audacious that scholars have been debating its implications ever since the translations were first published. It says, "These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down." Hidden words. The living Jesus. And the name Thomas, given in its full form, Didymos Judas Thomas. Didymos being the Greek word for twin. Judas being, in certain Eastern Christian traditions, Thomas's given name. Thomas being his Aramaic nickname, also meaning twin. The Gospel of Thomas does not describe the resurrection. It does not contain a passion narrative. It does not tell stories of miracles in the conventional sense. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, each introduced by the phrase "Jesus said," and each inviting the reader to find their meaning rather than having it explained. And embedded in the very opening of the text is a promise that is either the most extraordinary claim in ancient Christian literature or one of the most elaborate theological framings in the history of spiritual writing. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Will not die. Will not experience death. The distinction is significant. And the scholars who have devoted careers to understanding this text have spent decades working through what that distinction means, where it comes from, and whether it reflects a tradition about Thomas and about the words he heard from Jesus that goes back to sources earlier and more reliable than many people have assumed. To understand what the Gospel of Thomas represents and why it matters for understanding Thomas the Apostle, you have to understand the world in which it was found and the world in which it was written. The year was 1945. The location was near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. A group of farmers were digging near the base of a cliff when they struck a large sealed earthenware jar. What they found inside would transform the field of early Christian studies in ways that are still being fully processed. The jar contained 13 leather-bound codices, books in the ancient sense of the word, papyrus pages bound between leather covers. They were written in Coptic, the late form of the Egyptian language that became the liturgical language of Egyptian Christianity. And they contained texts that the Western scholarly world had never seen. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas. The discovery was significant in ways that went beyond the simple fact of finding a new text. It provided, for the first time in the modern era, direct access to a document that had been known about for centuries through references and partial quotations in other texts, but that had never been read in its complete form by anyone alive. The Church Fathers had mentioned the Gospel of Thomas. They had noted its existence. Some had quoted from it. Others had condemned it. But no one in the modern world had read the whole thing. Now they could. And what they found challenged, in fundamental ways, the picture of early Christianity that had been constructed from the canonical texts alone. The Gospel of Thomas is not a narrative text. There is no birth story, no ministry story, no passion narrative, no resurrection account. It is purely a collection of sayings, a wisdom text in a form that had precedent in the Jewish tradition of the wisdom literature and that was recognizable within the broader Hellenistic culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. But the sayings themselves were startling. Some of them had direct parallels in the canonical Gospels. Words that appeared in Matthew, Mark, and Luke appeared in the Gospel of Thomas in forms that were sometimes similar and sometimes significantly different. Different enough to raise serious questions about the relationship between the two traditions. Different enough to suggest that the Gospel of Thomas was not simply copying from the canonical Gospels but drawing on a separate stream of the tradition. Others had no parallel anywhere in the canonical texts. They were new. They were words attributed to Jesus that no one currently alive had ever heard before, because the last copy of the text in which they were preserved had been buried in the Egyptian desert before the medieval period. These new sayings were, and continue to be, deeply provocative. Not because they contradicted the canonical Gospels in ways that would undermine core Christian beliefs, though some of them do create theological tensions. But because they expanded the picture. They added dimensions. They suggested that the tradition of Jesus' teaching was richer, wider, and more varied than the four canonical Gospels alone could convey. And they raised the question, which has never been fully resolved, of where they came from. If some of the material in the Gospel of Thomas is genuinely early, genuinely close to the historical Jesus in some meaningful sense, then who preserved it? Who was responsible for this particular stream of transmission? Who was the authority behind this particular collection? The text says Thomas. And that answer leads directly into one of the most fascinating and most contested questions in the study of early Christianity. Who was Thomas? The name Thomas appears in the lists of the 12 apostles in all four canonical Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles. In the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the canonical Gospels, he appears only in the list and is otherwise invisible. In Matthew and Luke, similarly, he is a name in a list and nothing more. It is only in the Gospel of John that Thomas becomes a character with a speaking role, with a personality, with a distinctive relationship to the question of knowledge and belief that has made him one of the most theologically interesting figures in the entire New Testament. If this investigation opens something in you, the simplest thing you can do is subscribe. Every week, another hidden story. Another figure the official record barely preserved. Another question worth asking directly. There are 3 scenes in the Gospel of John where Thomas speaks or acts in a way that reveals something about who he is. The first is in the 11th chapter, when Jesus announces that he is going to return to Judea to visit the family of Lazarus. The disciples protest that the last time they were in Judea the religious authorities had tried to stone Jesus. The journey seems dangerous. It seems potentially fatal. And Thomas says, with a directness that is either courageous or resigned or some complex combination of the two, "Let us also go, that we may die with him. Let us also go, that we may die with him." This is not the Thomas of popular imagination. This is not the doubter who hangs back, who refuses to commit, who withholds himself until certainty is provided. This is a man who is willing to walk into probable death out of loyalty to someone he has chosen to follow. This is a man whose commitment is so thorough that he frames the worst possible outcome, his own death, as an acceptable price for staying alongside his teacher. The second scene is in the 14th chapter of John, the night before the crucifixion, during the long farewell discourse in which Jesus speaks at length to his disciples about what is coming and what it means. Jesus says that he is going to prepare a place for them, and that they know the way to where he is going. And Thomas says, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" This question is one of the most honest questions in the entire New Testament. It is not a question asked from lack of faith. It is a question asked from a genuine desire to understand. From a refusal to pretend to know something that has not been explained. From an intellectual honesty that will not substitute polite agreement for actual comprehension. Thomas will not say he understands when he does not. Jesus responds with what has become one of the most famous statements in the Gospel, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That statement, which has been cited, argued over, and theologized about for 2,000 years, was given in response to a question from Thomas. It was Thomas's refusal to pretend to understand what he did not understand that provoked the response. The third scene is the one everyone knows. The locked room. The absent disciple. The conditional demand for evidence. The appearance of Jesus. The invitation to touch. The declaration of faith. "My Lord and my God." These three scenes, taken together, construct a portrait of Thomas that is remarkably consistent and remarkably specific. He is courageous to the point of recklessness. He is intellectually honest to the point of stubbornness. He will not say what he does not mean. He will not believe what he has not experienced. He demands direct encounter rather than second-hand report. And when he gets that direct encounter, his response is not measured or cautious or hedged. It is total. "My Lord and my God." No qualification. No reservation. The man who demanded the most rigorous evidence gave the most complete declaration of faith. That portrait is the Thomas that the Eastern Christian traditions took as their founding figure. The Thomas who they said did not stay in the safe world of the Mediterranean mission but pushed east, further than anyone else, into territories that the other apostles had not reached. And those Eastern traditions had a great deal to say about what Thomas brought with him when he went. The tradition that Thomas traveled to India is one of the oldest and most persistent in all of early Christian literature. It is not a legend that developed centuries after the fact and then was retroactively attached to a convenient apostolic name. It is attested in sources that go back to the earliest centuries of the Church, in a geographical specificity and with a consistency that historians have taken increasingly seriously as archaeological and textual evidence has accumulated. The Acts of Thomas, a text from the early 3rd century that describes in narrative form the missionary journey of Thomas to India, is one of the most remarkable documents in all of early Christian literature. It is long. It is dramatic. It is theologically sophisticated. And it describes, with a specificity that is difficult to dismiss as pure invention, a missionary journey that takes Thomas through Parthia and into the subcontinent, where he establishes communities of believers in a region that the other apostles, focused on the Mediterranean world, had not reached. The Acts of Thomas is not a historically reliable document in the sense that a modern biography is reliable. It contains miracles, visions, extended theological speeches, and narrative elements that belong to the genre of ancient religious romance rather than to the genre of documentary history. No scholar treats it as a straightforward factual account of what Thomas actually did. But the core geographical claim, that Thomas went east rather than west, that his mission took him to the Indian subcontinent, is not a claim that historians can simply dismiss. Because it is corroborated by traditions that were alive and documented long before any Western Christian scholar would have had reason to invent them. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, on the southwestern coast of India, are one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. They trace their origin to the Apostle Thomas himself, who according to their tradition arrived on the Malabar coast in the year 52 of the Common Era, established 7 churches, and was eventually martyred near what is now the city of Chennai on the eastern coast. This tradition was alive and documented when European Christians first arrived in India in the 16th century. The Portuguese, who arrived in 1498, found a community of Christians who already had centuries of established practice, who had liturgical traditions in Syriac, the closest living language to the Aramaic that Jesus spoke, and who told stories about the founder of their faith with a specificity and a consistency that the arriving Europeans found both impressive and theologically complicated. The existence of the St. Thomas Christians is not in dispute. They exist. They have existed for a very long time. The question of whether their tradition genuinely goes back to the Apostle Thomas is one that historians debate, but it is a debate that must take seriously the extraordinary continuity and specificity of what that community has preserved. And what they have preserved includes not just the claim of apostolic foundation but a specific theological tradition, a specific way of understanding Jesus and the spiritual life, that has distinctive features not shared by the Western Christian traditions that developed independently. That distinctiveness is significant. If the Thomas tradition in India were simply a fabrication, a later invention designed to provide a respectable apostolic foundation for a community that wanted one, you would expect it to look like what it was imitating. You would expect the Indian Thomas tradition to be a mirror of whatever the dominant Christian tradition was at the time the fabrication supposedly occurred. Instead, it looks different. It has its own shape, its own emphases, its own ways of understanding the spiritual journey that have more in common with the Thomas tradition preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and in the Syriac Christianity of the East than with the Latin Christianity of the West that might have been the model for a fabricated tradition. That distinctiveness is evidence. Not conclusive evidence, but evidence that deserves to be taken seriously by anyone who wants to understand where the Thomas tradition came from and what it originally contained. The question of what Thomas heard and what Thomas taught is a question that takes on a very different character when you put the canonical Gospel of John alongside the Gospel of Thomas and read them together. The Gospel of John presents Thomas as a figure who demands direct experience rather than second-hand testimony, who insists on personal encounter rather than mediated report, who will not accept the word of others, however trustworthy, as a substitute for his own direct knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas presents itself as the record of hidden words, of sayings that require interpretation, of a teaching that is not exhausted by the surface meaning of the words but that contains deeper layers accessible to those who seek them. Put these two together and you get a portrait of Thomas as someone who was specifically concerned with the question of direct spiritual knowledge, with the question of what it means to know something rather than simply to believe what you have been told, with the question of the relationship between external authority and internal experience. These concerns are not accidental. They are not simply the result of one dramatic scene in the Gospel of John being misread by later communities. They are consistent across multiple independent streams of the Thomas tradition, streams that developed in very different geographical and cultural contexts but that converge on the same set of spiritual concerns. Thomas was the apostle of direct knowing. The Thomas tradition says that real knowledge requires seeking. If you are the kind of person who seeks rather than simply accepts, this channel exists for you. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community that takes these questions seriously. And the question that the traditions about him raise, the question that the Gospel of Thomas places at the center of its self-understanding, is whether the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke to Thomas represent a distinct and genuine stream of the teaching of Jesus that has been preserved in a form different from the 4 canonical Gospels. To engage seriously with this question, it is necessary to engage seriously with the scholarship on the Gospel of Thomas and on its relationship to the canonical tradition. The question of the date of the Gospel of Thomas has been one of the most contentious in the field of New Testament scholarship for the past several decades. The debate is not merely academic. The date of the text has significant implications for how it should be read and what authority it should be accorded. If the Gospel of Thomas was composed in the 2nd century, drawing primarily on the canonical Gospels as its sources and elaborating or modifying them according to the theological perspectives of a particular community, then it tells us a great deal about the diversity of 2nd century Christianity but relatively little about the historical Jesus or the historical Thomas. If, on the other hand, the Gospel of Thomas or significant portions of it drew on sources that predate or are independent of the canonical Gospels, then it represents a window into the earliest period of the Christian tradition, a window that looks onto a landscape that the canonical texts alone cannot fully show. The evidence bearing on this question is complex and contested. But several lines of argument point toward the conclusion that at least portions of the Gospel of Thomas preserve traditions that are genuinely early. The first and most important argument concerns the sayings that have parallels in the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share enormous amounts of material, and scholars have developed sophisticated theories about the literary relationships between these three texts. When the parallel sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are analyzed using the same tools, something interesting emerges. The Gospel of Thomas versions of these sayings often lack the allegorical interpretations, the theological glosses, and the contextualizing narrative frameworks that appear in the synoptic versions. They are, in many cases, shorter and more cryptic. They read, in the technical language of the tradition, as earlier in the development of the tradition rather than later. This is the kind of pattern that would be very difficult to explain if the Gospel of Thomas were simply copying from the Synoptic Gospels. If you are copying a text that has an elaborate interpretation attached to it, you do not usually strip away the interpretation and preserve only the core. You are more likely to preserve or even expand the interpretation. The fact that the Gospel of Thomas versions are frequently stripped down, frequently more cryptic and less interpreted than their synoptic parallels, suggests that they are drawing on the tradition at an earlier stage, before the interpretive frameworks were added. The second argument concerns the sayings that have no synoptic parallels at all. These unique sayings, which constitute a significant portion of the Gospel of Thomas, cannot be explained as derived from the canonical tradition. They must come from somewhere. And their character, the way they are phrased, the theological concerns they express, the spiritual world they inhabit, suggests a provenance in the same tradition as the sayings that do have synoptic parallels. If the shared sayings are early, the unshared sayings likely are too. The third argument is geographical and cultural. The Gospel of Thomas has affinities with the Syriac Christian tradition, with the form of Christianity that developed in the region of Syria and Mesopotamia, the region through which Thomas was said to have traveled on his way east. This geographical and cultural fit is not what you would expect if the text were a product of the Hellenistic Christianity of Alexandria or Rome. It fits the Thomas tradition. It fits the Eastern mission. It fits the world in which Thomas moved. Taken together, these arguments do not prove that the Gospel of Thomas goes back directly to Thomas himself, or that it preserves word for word what Thomas heard from Jesus after the resurrection. Such direct provenance would be impossible to establish on the basis of available evidence. But they do support the conclusion that the Gospel of Thomas draws on genuine early traditions, traditions that were preserved in the Thomas communities of the Eastern Mission and that represent a distinct and valuable stream of the Jesus tradition. What those traditions contain is a picture of Jesus and of the spiritual life that is at once deeply familiar and significantly strange to readers formed entirely by the canonical Gospels. The familiar elements are easy to recognize. The kingdom of God is a central theme, as it is throughout the synoptic tradition. The importance of seeking and finding is emphasized repeatedly. The contrast between the worldly and the spiritual, between the concerns of ordinary life and the concerns of the deepest life, runs throughout the collection. The strange elements are harder to summarize briefly because they resist summary almost by design. The Gospel of Thomas is a text that consistently refuses to do the interpretive work for the reader. It presents sayings and leaves them. It does not explain. It does not contextualize. It trusts, or demands, that the reader will engage actively with the text rather than passively receiving a packaged meaning. This is itself a theological statement. It is saying something about the nature of the knowledge that these words transmit. It is saying that this knowledge cannot be given by external authority. It can only be found by the person who seeks it directly. That is the Thomas principle. That is the epistemological stance that the entire Thomas tradition, from the Gospel of John to the Gospel of Thomas to the Acts of Thomas, consistently presents as the distinctive contribution of the apostle who was called the twin. Thomas, who was called twin, was himself a figure of double identity in the tradition. The name itself is significant. Didymos in Greek, Thomas in Aramaic, both meaning twin. Why was he called the twin? The tradition does not explain directly. But the name generated enormous speculation in the communities that preserved his memory. In some Syrian traditions, Thomas was understood as the twin brother of Jesus himself. Not in a literal biological sense, but in a spiritual or mystical sense. He was the one who most closely mirrored the nature of the one he followed. He was the disciple who most completely participated in the consciousness of his teacher. This reading of the name is not absent from the Gospel of Thomas itself. The text opens with the full name Didymos Judas Thomas in a way that foregrounds the twinning. And the content of the sayings, with their emphasis on the identity between the seeker and the sought, between the one who finds and the thing that is found, between the inner kingdom and the one who recognizes it, resonates with a tradition in which Thomas was understood as the apostle of spiritual identity rather than merely the apostle of intellectual doubt. The Thomas of popular imagination is the doubter. The one who required evidence. The one whose name has become synonymous, in the English-speaking world, with skepticism. Doubting Thomas. It is one of the most culturally durable epithets in the Western tradition. And it is, on any serious reading of the Gospel of John, a profound misreading of who Thomas actually was. Thomas did not doubt because he was spiritually weak. He refused to accept second-hand testimony because he was spiritually serious. The demand to know directly rather than to accept on authority is not a failure of faith. It is a particular form of spiritual commitment, a commitment to the kind of knowledge that has been transformed by direct encounter rather than merely informed by external report. The resurrection appearance to Thomas in John's Gospel is not a story about someone being corrected for an intellectual error. It is a story about someone receiving what they needed. Jesus does not rebuke Thomas for his demand. Jesus provides what Thomas demanded. He presents the wounds. He invites the touch. And Thomas responds with the most complete statement of faith in the fourth Gospel. The teacher who spent his ministry consistently honoring the desire for direct encounter honored Thomas's version of that desire. The teacher who had said that those who seek will find provided what Thomas sought. My Lord and my God. The post-resurrection period in the tradition of Thomas is not primarily a period of doubt resolved. It is a period of transmission. Of extended conversation. Of the deepening of what had been glimpsed in those 8 days between absences, between the first appearance and the second, between the night when the others received the Spirit and the night when Thomas finally stood in the presence of the one he had been willing to die for. What did Thomas hear in the days and weeks that followed? The canonical tradition tells us almost nothing about the specific content of the post-resurrection teachings that Jesus gave to his disciples before the ascension. The Gospel of John gestures at it. The Acts of the Apostles describes a 40-day period of appearances in which Jesus spoke to the disciples about the kingdom of God. But the specific content of those conversations is not recorded in the canonical texts. The Gospel of Thomas claims to be the record of exactly that. Hidden words. Words spoken by the living Jesus. Words that the canonical tradition, for whatever reason, did not preserve in the same form. Whether that claim is historically accurate in a strict sense is impossible to determine with the evidence available. But the claim itself is theologically important, because it names something that the canonical tradition implicitly acknowledges: there was more than what was written down. The tradition itself says so. John's Gospel ends with the observation that if everything Jesus did were written down, the whole world could not contain the books. Not everything was written down. Something was left out. The Thomas tradition claims to preserve part of what was left out. The specific sayings of the Gospel of Thomas that are most relevant to the question of what Thomas heard after the resurrection are the ones that most clearly do not fit the narrative framework of the Synoptic Gospels and that most clearly belong to the contemplative and mystical dimension of early Christian spirituality. Saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most striking examples. It presents Jesus saying that the kingdom is not in the sky and not in the sea. It is inside you and it is outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. That saying has a synoptic parallel of sorts, in Luke's statement that the kingdom of God is within you or among you. But the Thomas version is more developed, more explicit, more directly focused on the question of self-knowledge as the path to spiritual knowledge. Know yourselves, and you will know God. That is not a statement that fits comfortably in the framework of the canonical Christian tradition, which has generally emphasized faith, grace, and external revelation over self-knowledge as the path to the divine. But it fits precisely the portrait of Thomas as the apostle of direct knowing, the apostle for whom the demand to encounter the truth directly rather than to accept it from an external authority was not a weakness but a spiritual calling. Saying 50 of the Gospel of Thomas is another example that stands out. It presents the disciples asking Jesus where they came from and where they are going. And Jesus answers that they came from the light, from the place where the light came into being by itself and stood and appeared in their image. From the light. Before the world. Before the beginning as the canonical tradition describes it. That cosmological vision, of human beings as having an origin in the divine light that precedes creation, is not absent from the canonical tradition. The prologue of the Gospel of John, with its language of the light shining in the darkness, gestures toward it. But in the Gospel of Thomas it is developed more fully, more explicitly, and in a way that places the human being's relationship to that primordial light at the center of the spiritual journey. The goal of the spiritual life, in the Thomas tradition, is not simply to believe the right things about Jesus. It is to know where you came from and where you are going. To recognize the light from which you emerged and to which you are returning. To find, in the act of finding yourself, the one who sent you. That is the teaching of the living Jesus as the Thomas tradition preserved it. And whether or not it goes back in precise form to the words spoken by Jesus in the post-resurrection appearances, it represents a coherent and sophisticated vision of the spiritual life that has proven, over the centuries since the Gospel of Thomas was rediscovered, to resonate with readers from an extraordinary range of backgrounds and traditions. The reception of the Gospel of Thomas since its publication in modern translations in the 1950s has been one of the most interesting chapters in the history of religious thought. Academic scholars, theologians, contemplatives, and ordinary readers have all responded to the text, and they have not all responded in the same way. The diversity of responses is itself evidence of the richness of what the text contains. Some scholars have approached the Gospel of Thomas primarily as a historical document, a source of evidence for the diversity of early Christianity, for the existence of traditions about Jesus that diverged significantly from the canonical tradition, for the complexity of the processes by which the Christian canon was formed. For these scholars, the question of whether the text is spiritually authoritative is secondary to the question of what it tells us about the past. Other scholars have approached it primarily as a theological document, engaging with its claims on their own terms and asking what kind of spirituality it represents, what understanding of Jesus it preserves, what vision of the human being and its relationship to the divine it articulates. Contemplatives and mystics from various traditions have found in the Gospel of Thomas a language that resonates with their own experience of the inner life. The emphasis on direct knowledge, on the kingdom within, on the primordial light as the origin and destination of human consciousness, speaks to a dimension of spiritual experience that the canonical tradition acknowledges but does not always develop as fully. And critics, both from within the Christian tradition and from outside it, have raised important questions about the theological implications of the text, about the ways in which its emphasis on self-knowledge can be misread as a form of individualism or spiritual narcissism that loses the relational and communal dimensions of the Christian life. All of these responses are engaging with something real. The Gospel of Thomas is rich enough to sustain multiple readings. It is demanding enough to resist easy appropriation. And it is connected to the figure of Thomas in ways that are deep enough to reward serious attention to who Thomas actually was and what the tradition associated with his name actually preserves. The Eastern Thomas tradition, the tradition that developed in Syria and India and the regions between them, has preserved aspects of the Thomas story that the Western tradition, focused as it was on the Mediterranean world and on the communities associated with Peter and Paul, largely overlooked. In the Syriac tradition, Thomas is not primarily the doubter. He is the twin. The one who mirrored the consciousness of Jesus in a way that made him uniquely capable of transmitting the deeper dimensions of the teaching. The Acts of Thomas, for all its legendary embellishments, preserves a coherent theological vision in which Thomas is the apostle of the bridal chamber, the apostle of divine intimacy, the apostle of the marriage between the human soul and the divine light. That imagery, strange as it sounds to ears formed by the doctrinal formulations of Western Christianity, has deep roots in the Jewish and early Christian tradition. The Song of Songs was read allegorically as a description of the relationship between the soul and God. The metaphor of marriage and intimacy as the language of the deepest spiritual union was not invented by the Thomas tradition. It was developed and intensified by it. And in India, in the communities that trace their origin to Thomas's mission, the tradition has been preserved not only in story and liturgy but in a way of understanding the spiritual life that has lived continuously for nearly 2,000 years. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala have maintained their practice, their liturgy in Syriac, their distinctive theological emphases, through the arrival of the Portuguese, through colonial pressure toward Latin Christianity, through independence and the 20th century. They have continued because they have something worth preserving. What they have preserved, at its deepest level, is a tradition about what Thomas heard. About what the living Jesus spoke to the one who demanded direct encounter and received it. About the hidden words that the twin of the teacher carried east, away from Jerusalem, away from the Mediterranean world, into the subcontinent where they took root and flowered in a form different from any other branch of the Christian tree. The question of what Thomas heard is ultimately a question that cannot be answered with certainty. The historical record is fragmentary. The texts are complex and contested. The distance between the 1st century and the 21st is enormous. But the question is worth asking. It is worth asking because Thomas himself refused to accept easy answers. He refused to accept second-hand testimony when direct encounter was what was needed. He refused to pretend to know what he did not know. He refused to say he understood when he was genuinely confused. To engage with the question of Thomas in a way that Thomas himself would recognize as serious engagement requires that same honesty. It requires acknowledging what we know and what we do not know. It requires holding the evidence carefully and drawing conclusions proportionate to its strength. It requires resisting the temptation to resolve the genuine tensions and ambiguities that the Thomas tradition contains. Thomas refused to believe without evidence. The scholarly tradition that takes him seriously tries to follow that example. What the evidence shows is this. There was a figure in the earliest period of the Christian movement who bore the name Thomas or Didymos. He was one of the 12. He was present for the ministry of Jesus and for the resurrection appearances. He had a specific and distinctive personality that the Gospel of John preserves in a portrait that is consistent across 3 separate scenes. After the resurrection, the tradition associated with his name spread east. It went to Syria, to Edessa, to Persia, to India. It developed a distinctive theological character that emphasized direct knowledge over second-hand belief, contemplative encounter over doctrinal assent, the inner kingdom over external authority. At some point, probably in the late 1st or early 2nd century, a collection of sayings was assembled in a community that identified with Thomas and used his name as the authority for what it preserved. That collection, the Gospel of Thomas, drew on genuine early traditions about the teaching of Jesus and developed them in the context of the Thomas community's particular spiritual concerns. What that collection preserved was not a simple repetition of what the canonical Gospels record. It preserved a different dimension of the same tradition. A dimension focused on direct knowing, on the hidden depths of the teaching, on what Jesus said to those who had ears to hear that went beyond what could be said to everyone. Hidden words. The living Jesus. These are not metaphors chosen carelessly. They are describing something specific about the nature of the tradition that the Thomas communities preserved. A tradition that said the teaching of Jesus was not exhausted by what was written down. That there was more. That the more was preserved by those who received it directly and transmitted it carefully. Whether you accept that claim at face value or whether you read it as a theologically motivated framing of a later tradition, the claim itself is significant. It tells you what the Thomas communities thought they possessed. It tells you what they believed Thomas had heard. And it tells you why, 2,000 years later, the figure of Thomas still raises questions that the canonical tradition alone cannot fully answer. He was there. He heard. He demanded direct encounter and received it. My Lord and my God. And then he went east, carrying what he had heard into a world that the other apostles had not reached, planting what he carried in soil different from any other soil in which the tradition took root. The tree that grew from that planting is still growing. The tradition that Thomas carried is still alive in the prayers and liturgies of the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala. It is still alive in the Gospel of Thomas, studied and debated and meditated on by readers around the world who find in its demands something that the canonical tradition opens but does not always fully develop. It is alive in the question that Thomas himself embodied. How do you know? Not what do you believe? Not what have you been told? Not what does the authority say? But how do you know? That question, asked by a man in a locked room who refused to believe what the others told him and demanded to encounter the truth directly, is still the most important question that the Thomas tradition asks. And the answer that the tradition gives, in the hidden words, in the living Jesus, in the teaching that requires interpretation rather than passive reception, in the kingdom that is inside you and outside you at the same time, that answer is still being worked out by every reader who opens the Gospel of Thomas and sits with its demands. By every member of the St. Thomas communities in India who prays in a liturgical language that descends in a direct line from the language that Jesus spoke. By every scholar who reads the fragments and the parallels and the arguments and tries to reconstruct, with the care that the subject demands, what was heard and what was transmitted and what was preserved. The hidden words are not hidden because they were suppressed. They are hidden because they require the work of finding. They reward the seeker. They yield their meaning to the one who is willing to sit with them long enough and honestly enough to let them speak. Thomas knew this. He refused the easy path of second-hand belief. He waited for direct encounter. And when it came, when the wounds were shown and the invitation to touch was extended, Thomas did not measure his response. My Lord and my God. 6 words. Every word necessary. Not one word too many. That is the Thomas of the tradition. The twin who mirrored his teacher. The one who heard the hidden words. The apostle who went east with what he had heard and planted it in the soil of India where it has grown for 2,000 years. The man who demanded to know and received knowing. And whose question is still alive in every person who refuses to accept second-hand testimony as a substitute for direct encounter with the truth. How do you know? Ask Thomas. He will tell you that you have to find out for yourself. That is the hidden word he is still speaking. To anyone who has ears to hear. The scholarly debate about the Gospel of Thomas has evolved significantly since the initial translations appeared in the 1950s and 1960s. The earliest responses to the discovery were shaped, understandably, by the frameworks that scholars had already developed for understanding early Christian diversity. The Gospel of Thomas was quickly categorized by some as a Gnostic text, placed in the company of the other documents found at Nag Hammadi, many of which did belong to recognizably Gnostic traditions with their characteristic cosmological dualism, their elaborate mythology of divine beings and fallen sparks of light, their emphasis on a special knowledge available only to the initiated. That categorization was, in retrospect, too quick and too broad. Subsequent decades of scholarship have produced a more nuanced picture. The Gospel of Thomas does share certain features with the broader world of Gnostic thought. The emphasis on knowledge, on the hidden teaching, on the light that precedes the material world. But it lacks many of the features that define Gnostic texts most precisely. There is no elaborate mythology of divine emanations. There is no systematic cosmological dualism that sets the material world against the spiritual. There is no detailed account of the demiurge, the creator god of Gnostic cosmology who is distinguished from the true highest God. The Gospel of Thomas is, in the assessment of many scholars who have worked most carefully with the text, something different from Gnosticism in the technical sense. It belongs to a family of early Christian spirituality that emphasized wisdom, direct knowledge, and the interior dimension of the spiritual life. It has more in common with certain currents of Jewish wisdom literature, with the Q source that scholars have reconstructed from the common material in Matthew and Luke, and with the contemplative dimensions of early Syrian Christianity than it does with the fully developed Gnostic systems of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This recategorization matters for how the text should be read and what historical period it should be assigned to. If the Gospel of Thomas is a Gnostic text of the 2nd century, it is a secondary development within the Christian tradition, a creative reinterpretation of earlier material through a theological lens that was itself secondary. If the Gospel of Thomas is an early wisdom text that preserves traditions from a genuinely early period, it is a primary source. Not a reinterpretation but a preservation. Not a development from the canonical tradition but a parallel stream that flowed alongside it from the beginning. The evidence increasingly favors the second interpretation. One of the most important pieces of evidence is the relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and the hypothetical Q source. Q, as scholars reconstruct it from the common material in Matthew and Luke, is a collection of sayings of Jesus with a distinctive theological character. It emphasizes wisdom rather than apocalyptic theology. It presents Jesus primarily as a wisdom teacher rather than as an apocalyptic judge. It contains sayings that are more challenging, more demanding, and less domesticated than much of what appears in the narrative framework of the Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas overlaps significantly with Q. Many of the sayings that appear in Q appear in the Gospel of Thomas in versions that are comparable in their age indicators. And the theological character of the two collections is similar in ways that are very difficult to explain if the Gospel of Thomas is simply a 2nd century creation drawing on the canonical Gospels. This parallel suggests that both Q and the Gospel of Thomas drew on a common early tradition, a tradition of Jesus's sayings that circulated in the period before the narrative Gospels were written and that had its own integrity and its own theological character. If that is correct, then the Gospel of Thomas is not a secondary elaboration of the canonical tradition. It is a witness to something older than the canonical tradition in its current form. Something that goes back to the earliest period of the movement, to the circles that formed around the teaching of Jesus during his lifetime and in the immediate aftermath of his death and resurrection. And the tradition says those circles included Thomas. The relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John is one of the most technically complex problems in the study of early Christian literature. The two texts are different in almost every way that texts can be different. The Gospel of John is a long narrative text with a highly developed theological framework. The Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings without narrative and without systematic theology. The Gospel of John is in Greek and belongs to the Hellenistic literary world of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Gospel of Thomas is preserved in Coptic and has strong connections to the Syriac world. And yet there are connections between them that scholars have not been able to ignore. The most obvious connection is the figure of Thomas himself. The Gospel of John gives Thomas more character development than any other canonical Gospel. The Gospel of Thomas claims Thomas as its authority. That shared focus on Thomas is not coincidental. It reflects a historical relationship of some kind between the communities that produced and preserved these texts. Some scholars have argued that the Gospel of John was written in part as a response to the Thomas tradition. That the scenes in which Thomas appears in the Gospel of John are crafted specifically to address the theological claims that the Thomas communities were making about their apostle and his tradition. That the scene of the locked room and the demand for evidence is not simply a neutral historical record but a theological argument, an attempt to honor Thomas's particular way of knowing while also subordinating it to the charismatic faith of the resurrection community. On this reading, when Jesus says to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed," he is not simply correcting Thomas. He is addressing the entire Thomas community, the community that emphasized direct personal encounter as the path to knowledge, and reminding them that the path of faith, the path of those who did not have the direct encounter that Thomas had, was also blessed. Was not second class. Was not inferior to the Thomas way of knowing. This reading gives the scene a theological richness that the simple story of a doubter being corrected does not have. It situates the scene within the real debates of the early Christian communities about the nature of spiritual knowledge and the basis of religious authority. And it suggests that the Thomas tradition was real and significant enough to require address in one of the most theologically sophisticated texts of the early Christian period. The Eastern expansion of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries is a chapter of Christian history that the Western tradition has largely overlooked, for reasons that are more geographical and political than theological. The Christianity that shaped Europe and the Americas was Mediterranean Christianity, the tradition that developed along the trade routes and in the cities of the Roman Empire, the tradition that produced the councils and the creeds and the institutional structures that defined Western Christendom. But it was not the only form of Christianity that developed in the first centuries. Alongside it, and in some respects preceding it, there was an Eastern Christianity that moved through Mesopotamia, through Persia, through Central Asia, and eventually to India and to China. That Eastern Christianity had its own theologians, its own liturgies, its own understanding of the spiritual life. It was not simply a pale reflection of what was happening in Rome and Antioch and Alexandria. It had its own distinctive character, shaped by the cultures it moved through and by the particular streams of the Jesus tradition that it carried. The Thomas tradition was one of the primary streams of that Eastern Christianity. The Church of the East, which developed from the early Christian communities of Mesopotamia and Persia, produced theologians of extraordinary sophistication. Ephrem the Syrian, writing in the 4th century, is one of the greatest poets and theologians of the early Christian period, whose work draws on the Syriac tradition with all its distinctive emphases and whose influence on subsequent Christian spirituality, though less well known in the West than Augustine or Chrysostom, is profound and lasting. The mystical tradition of the Church of the East, with its emphasis on the experience of the divine light, on the transformation of the inner life through contemplative practice, on the encounter with the living Christ as the center of the spiritual journey, resonates deeply with what the Thomas tradition, as preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and the Acts of Thomas, articulates. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. It is the same river flowing through different landscapes, expressing itself differently in different soils, but carrying the same water. The water came from the source. And the tradition says that Thomas was the one who brought it east. One of the most striking features of the Gospel of Thomas, from the perspective of someone reading it carefully for the first time, is the consistent refusal of the text to do the interpretive work for the reader. In the Synoptic Gospels, parables are generally followed by interpretations. Jesus tells the parable of the sower and then explains what it means. He tells the parable of the weeds among the wheat and then explains each element. The disciples ask for explanations and receive them. In the Gospel of Thomas, this pattern is almost completely absent. A saying is given. Sometimes a very short narrative frame is provided, the disciples said, or they showed him. But the interpretation, the explanation of what the saying means, is almost never given. The reader is left with the saying and their own capacity to engage with it. This is not a textual deficiency. It is a pedagogical strategy. The Gospel of Thomas is not interested in transmitting information to passive readers. It is interested in activating a capacity in the reader. In provoking an encounter with the material that will produce understanding as the result of active engagement rather than passive reception. That pedagogical strategy is itself part of the tradition about Thomas. The man who refused second-hand testimony. The man who demanded direct encounter. The man who would not substitute the report of others for his own direct experience. The Gospel of Thomas teaches the way Thomas learned. It demands that you bring yourself to the text. That you work with it. That you find the interpretation rather than receiving it. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. That is the promise and the demand with which the text opens. The finding is the point. Not the being told. The demand of the Gospel of Thomas, understood in light of the portrait of Thomas that the Gospel of John preserves, is a demand that is both radically personal and radically serious. It is saying that these words contain something that will transform the person who encounters them correctly. That the transformation comes from the encounter, from the direct engagement, from the finding that happens when the seeking is genuine. That is what the living Jesus spoke to the one who had been willing to die with him and who had refused to believe without evidence. Not a set of propositions to be accepted. Not a creed to be recited. Not a story to be told about someone else. But words that require finding. That reward the seeker. That yield their deepest meaning only to those who approach them with the seriousness they deserve. Whether you situate yourself within the Christian tradition or outside it, whether you read the Gospel of Thomas as scripture or as historical source or as philosophical text, the demand it makes is the same. Find the interpretation. That is what Thomas heard. That is what he transmitted. That is what he carried east, past the boundaries of the world that the other apostles reached, into the soil of India where it has grown for 2,000 years. And that is what has come down to us, through the fragments and the traditions and the communities that refuse to let it be lost. The hidden words. The living Jesus. The twin who mirrored his teacher. The apostle who demanded to know and received knowing. His question is still the most important question the tradition asks. How do you know? Find the answer directly. That is what he heard. That is what he passed on. And that is what, after 2,000 years, is still waiting to be found. By anyone who has the seriousness to look. And the honesty to refuse second-hand answers. My Lord and my God. 6 words. Every word necessary. The rest is left for you to find. The city of Edessa, which is now Urfa in southeastern Turkey, holds a specific and important place in the history of the Thomas tradition. Edessa was one of the great cities of early Syriac Christianity. It was a crossroads, literally and culturally, between the Mediterranean world of Rome and Greece and the eastern world of Persia and Mesopotamia. Its population was diverse. Its intellectual culture was sophisticated. Its Christian community was, from a very early period, one of the most theologically active in the Eastern world. And Edessa claimed a special connection to Thomas. The Abgar legend, which exists in multiple forms and which the church historian Eusebius preserves in a version he claims to have translated from the Syriac archives of Edessa, tells a story about an exchange of letters between Jesus and Abgar, the king of Edessa. In the legend, Abgar was sick and wrote to Jesus asking him to come and heal him. Jesus replied by letter, promising that after his ascension he would send one of his disciples to Edessa. The disciple he sent, according to the tradition, was Thaddeus, who is also sometimes identified with Judas Thomas, the twin. Whatever the historical value of the Abgar legend, it reflects the conviction of the Edessene Christian community that their foundation was apostolic. That they had a direct connection to the earliest period of the movement. That what they preserved was not a secondary tradition but something that went back to the source. And what the Edessene tradition preserved was the Thomas tradition. The Syriac New Testament that developed in Edessa and became the standard biblical text of the Eastern churches, the Peshitta, contains the canonical Gospels and letters. But the community that produced it also preserved the Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, and other Thomas literature. The geographical position of Edessa is significant for understanding how the Thomas tradition moved east. If Thomas or his immediate disciples passed through Edessa on the way to India, as the Acts of Thomas suggests, then Edessa would have been a node in the transmission network, a place where the tradition was received and preserved and then passed on to communities further east. The Syriac Christianity that developed in Edessa and spread eastward along the Silk Road is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of religion. It reached China by the 7th century, where it left inscriptions and monuments that still exist. It established communities in Central Asia that persisted for centuries. It planted itself in India, where it survives to this day. All of this eastern expansion was carried, in significant part, under the name of Thomas. His name was the authority. His tradition was the content. His question, how do you know, was the engine that drove the seeking that the tradition demanded. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is a text that must be briefly distinguished from the Gospel of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi, because the two are frequently confused despite being completely different texts with completely different content and historical provenance. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is a text that describes miracles and episodes from the childhood of Jesus. It is a later text, probably from the 2nd century, with no serious claim to historical authenticity. It was popular in certain communities but was generally recognized as legendary even by ancient readers who were far more credulous about miraculous stories than modern critics tend to be. The Gospel of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi is a different document entirely. It has nothing to do with the childhood of Jesus. It is a collection of sayings attributed to the adult Jesus, most of them apparently from the period of his public ministry and some, in the tradition of the communities that preserved it, from the post-resurrection period. The confusion between these two texts in popular discussions of Thomas is unfortunate because it tends to color the reception of the more serious Nag Hammadi text with associations that belong to the other. The infancy Gospel of Thomas is a pious legend. The Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas is a serious and historically significant document that requires and rewards serious engagement. This distinction matters because serious engagement with the Gospel of Thomas requires clarity about what kind of text it is and what kind of claims it makes. The claims it makes are significant but they are specific. It does not claim to be a complete account of the teaching of Jesus. It does not claim to supersede the other Gospels. It claims to preserve hidden sayings, sayings that require interpretation, sayings that were given to a particular disciple for a particular kind of transmission. That is a precise claim. And it is a claim that deserves a precise response, neither uncritical acceptance nor reflexive dismissal. The precise response requires asking, as carefully as the evidence allows, what tradition stands behind the text. Where did the sayings come from? Why they were preserved in this form rather than in the narrative form of the canonical Gospels? What community preserved them and why? The answers to those questions point consistently toward the Thomas community of the Eastern Mission. Toward the disciples of Thomas who continued his tradition in Syria and beyond. Toward the communities that identified his particular way of knowing, his demand for direct encounter, his refusal to accept second-hand testimony, as the appropriate framework for engaging with the teaching of Jesus. Those communities preserved what they had received in the form that was appropriate to its nature. A collection of sayings that required the finding of interpretation was preserved as a collection of sayings that required the finding of interpretation. The form is the message. Thomas heard hidden words. He transmitted them in a form that kept them hidden, that kept them requiring the work of finding, that honored the epistemological principle that had been his own entry point into the tradition. You have to find out for yourself. That principle, embedded in the form of the text, is the most important single thing that the Gospel of Thomas preserves. More important than any individual saying. More important than the historical questions about its date and sources. More important than the theological debates about its relationship to the canonical tradition. The form of the demand. The insistence that knowing requires direct encounter rather than the acceptance of received authority. That is Thomas. That is what he heard. That is what he transmitted. That is what has come down through 2,000 years of a tradition that the Western Christian world largely forgot and that the Eastern world, in its own way, never did. The moment of Thomas's doubt and Thomas's faith, compressed into those 8 days in the Gospel of John, between the first appearance and the second, between the locked room on the evening of the first day and the room 8 days later when Thomas finally stood before the one he had been waiting for, that moment is one of the most theologically rich in the entire Gospel tradition. 8 days. The disciples saw the risen Jesus and Thomas was not there. For 8 days, Thomas lived with the testimony of people he trusted completely, people whose word he had no external reason to doubt, and he refused to let that testimony substitute for his own encounter. 8 days of refusing. 8 days of waiting for what he needed. And then the encounter came. And Thomas responded with the fullness that the 8 days of waiting had prepared in him. My Lord and my God. Not the response of someone who was persuaded by an argument. Not the response of someone who was shown evidence and accepted it reluctantly. The response of someone who waited until the encounter was real, until the meeting was direct, until second-hand testimony had been replaced by the thing itself, and who then found that what he had been waiting for was more than he had known to ask for. My Lord and my God. That is what direct encounter produces in the Thomas tradition. That is what the hidden words of the living Jesus were given to produce. Not assent to a proposition. Not acceptance of an authority. but the complete response of a complete encounter. The twin who mirrored his teacher. The one who demanded direct knowing and received it. The apostle who carried what he had received to the furthest reaches of the Eastern world. And whose tradition is still alive. In the prayers of the St. Thomas Christians. In the words of the Gospel of Thomas, still demanding interpretation, still resisting passive reception, still asking you to find rather than to be told. In the question that Thomas himself never stopped asking. How do you know? Find out. Directly. That is the hidden word that Thomas is still speaking. To anyone who has ears to hear it. There is one more dimension of the Thomas tradition that deserves attention before this investigation reaches its conclusion. It is the dimension that the name itself opens. The twin. In Greek, Didymos. In Aramaic, Thomas. Both words meaning the same thing. A person who carries a double identity by definition. A person whose very name announces a relationship of mirroring, of correspondence, of one thing reflecting another. Why was he called the twin? The canonical tradition offers no explanation. His brother, if he had a biological twin, is never named. The name is simply given, twice, once in Aramaic and once in Greek, as if the emphasis were intentional. As if someone wanted to be certain that this was how he was known. The Syriac tradition developed an answer that is theologically rich even if it cannot be verified historically. Thomas was the twin because he was the one who most completely mirrored the inner life of Jesus. Not in the sense of imitating his external behavior, but in the sense of participating in his consciousness. Of knowing from the inside what Jesus knew. Of being, in the language of the tradition, the spiritual twin of the one he followed. This reading of the name fits the portrait of Thomas in the Gospel of John with a precision that is striking. The man who refused second-hand testimony was the man who demanded to know from the inside rather than the outside. The man who insisted on direct encounter was the man whose spiritual constitution required participation rather than observation. The man who finally said "My Lord and my God" was the man whose encounter with the risen Jesus was complete in a way that the encounters of the others, however genuine, perhaps were not. His Lord and his God. Not the Lord and God. The possessive is personal. The knowledge is direct. The encounter is specific to this person in this moment. That is the twin's encounter. That is the knowledge that the twin carries. And that is what he transmitted. Not a theology about Jesus. Not a doctrine concerning Jesus. But the experience of meeting Jesus directly. Of being changed by that meeting. Of knowing, in the way that only direct encounter can produce knowing, who and what had been met. The Gospel of Thomas is the record of the teaching that produced that knowing in Thomas and that Thomas believed could produce it in others. The hidden words. The living Jesus. The invitation to find rather than to be told. The twins' transmission of the twins' encounter. 2,000 years later, the tradition is still alive. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala still pray. Their liturgy in Syriac, descended in a direct line from the language closest to the language Jesus spoke, still carries the mark of the tradition that Thomas planted. The Gospel of Thomas is still being read, studied, wrestled with, argued over, meditated on by readers who find in its demand something that the canonical tradition opens but does not always develop as fully. The question Thomas asked is still the most important question in the Thomas tradition. How do you know? Not what do you believe? Not what have you been told? Not what does the authority say? How do you know? The answer is still waiting to be found by anyone who takes the question seriously enough to pursue it directly. Thomas pursued it directly. He demanded the encounter. He received it. My Lord and my God. And then he went east. Carrying the hidden words. Transmitting the twins' knowing. Planting the tradition in the furthest soil it has ever reached. Where it is still growing. Where it will continue to grow. For as long as there are people who refuse second-hand answers to the most important questions. That is Thomas. That is the tradition he carried. That is what he heard from the living Jesus after the resurrection. Hidden words. Still hidden. Still waiting to be found. By anyone who has the seriousness and the honesty to look. The investigation of Thomas is ultimately an investigation into the nature of religious knowledge itself. What the Thomas tradition insists on, across every form in which it has been preserved, is that there is a difference between knowing and believing on authority. That the difference matters. That the entire spiritual journey is organized around the movement from the second to the first. Believing on authority is not nothing. It is the beginning. It is what carries most people through most of their spiritual lives. It is what the community provides when direct encounter is not yet available. It is what the tradition offers as a bridge across the gap between where a person is and where the tradition says they could go. But it is not the destination. Thomas refused to mistake the bridge for the destination. He insisted on the destination itself. And the tradition that bears his name, the Eastern Christian tradition with its emphasis on direct encounter with the divine light, with its contemplative practices designed to prepare the person for that encounter, with its liturgical forms that are themselves a kind of sustained reaching toward the source, that tradition has never forgotten what Thomas insisted on. The destination is direct knowing. The journey is whatever it takes to get there. The hidden words of the living Jesus are the map. And the finding of their interpretation is the arrival. That is what Thomas heard. That is what Thomas carried. That is what has come down to us, through the fragments and the communities and the scrolls buried in the Egyptian desert and the prayers spoken in Syriac on the Malabar coast. The twin is still speaking. The hidden words are still hidden. And the invitation to find them is still open. To anyone willing to follow the Thomas way. Directly. Without substituting someone else's encounter for your own. My Lord and my God. The words are available. The encounter is possible. The tradition points the way. The rest is yours to find. Thomas waited 8 days. 8 days of holding the question open. Of refusing to close it prematurely. Of insisting that the answer had to come from the right place, in the right form, through direct encounter rather than inherited certainty. Most people never wait that long for anything. But Thomas knew that some questions cannot be answered by someone else on your behalf. That some knowledge only arrives when you have waited long enough, honestly enough, and seriously enough to receive it. That is the tradition he left behind. That is what he carried east. That is what, 2,000 years later, is still waiting for anyone willing to ask the question with the same seriousness he brought to it. The investigation does not end here. It never ends. Each hidden figure in this history opens into another. Each lost text points toward others still waiting to be found. Each question answered honestly produces 3 more that deserve the same honesty. If that is the kind of inquiry you came here for, subscribe to this channel. Every week, another investigation. Another figure the official record barely preserved. Another layer of the tradition that the surface reading cannot reach. If this episode was worth your time, a like costs nothing and tells the algorithm that careful, serious historical investigation deserves a wider audience. That is how the hidden stories stop being hidden. And if you know someone who asks these kinds of questions, share this with them. The Thomas tradition says real knowledge travels person to person. It always has. My Lord and my God. 6 words. Every word necessary. The rest is still yours to find.